Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon if you're joining us in Nairobi or East Africa. My name is Vivek Chilakuri. I'm the Director of the Technology and National Security Program at CNAS, the Center for New American Security, and thanks for joining us for this virtual event on countering the digital Silk Road in Kenya. This event is part of a major research project at CNAS where we're digging into the U.S. China technology competition in key emerging markets across the global south. And this is the third event that we've held on this subject. The first one focused on Indonesia, the second on Brazil, and today we focus on Kenya. And to help us unpack the changing and consequential competition between the United States and Kenya, United States and China within Kenya, we have three distinguished panelists who have perspectives from the private sector, from government, and from civil society to help us uncover these dynamics. And so I'll introduce them, and then we're going to have a moderated discussion to dig into some of these issues. And if you're watching virtually, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions by dropping them into the chat, and we can get to that towards the end of the discussion. So let's dive right in, and let me introduce our first speaker, Maxwell Okello, who is the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Kenya, where he is charged with driving strategy and overseeing the smooth operations of the chamber into its next level of growth. He previously worked as a managing partner and co-founder of Adam TDF, a boutique strategy firm, and he advises many boards and senior management teams in Kenya and across the region, and holds a degree in design and visual communications. Max was also very gracious to host me and a colleague in Nairobi last December, where we visited for a research trip to prepare for the report that we released earlier last month on the subject. Our second speaker is Jane Munga, who's a fellow in the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focusing on technology policy. Her career has focused on policymaking with an emphasis on the potential of digital technologies for digital development. Prior to joining Carnegie, Jane worked for the government of Kenya as an advisor and economic expert. In that capacity, she focused on digital economy policies and strategies for digital transformation and inclusion. Jane holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science and Government and Master's degree in Economics and Management from the University of Alabama and a bachelor's from Stillman College. And last but not least, our third panelist is Maureen Farrell, who is a Vice President for Global Partnership at Valor, a strategic advisory and risk management firm based in Nairobi, but she is based here on the East Coast. With 25 years of experience focused on Africa, Maureen has held several roles in both government and the private sector. Most recently, she served at the U.S. Department of Defense as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, overseeing defense policy and strategy on the continent. And before that, she was the Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council, where she led U.S. interagency efforts and policy coordination for defense, diplomacy, development, and also led the Digital Transformation with Africa initiative at the NSC. And she brings extensive experience and is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. So we have an excellent group of panelists. Thank you all for making the time for joining us this morning or this afternoon. And let's just jump right in. So Max, let me start with a question for you to help set the scene for this discussion. 2024 marked the 60th anniversary of U.S.-Kenya diplomatic relations. What do you see as the defining features of the relationship today, and especially when it comes to technology cooperation?
Thank you, Vivek, for having me, and it's a pleasure to be on this platform this evening. As you mentioned, it's 60 years of a bilateral relationship between Kenya and the US. It's a really robust relationship across economic cooperation, security cooperation, democracy and human rights, regional stability, public health, climate change. It's actually quite a deep and meaningful cooperation and relationship that Kenya has had with the US over those many years. In technology specifically, as you know, Kenya is a Silicon Savannah in Africa, and it's the home to several of your major US tech multinationals, so the likes of Google, Microsoft, Cisco, Oracle, the list goes on. And most of these companies are not just in Kenya for Kenya, but they're in Kenya for the entire region. So Kenya is a regional hub for most of these companies. And these companies are, they're advancing digital skills, they're advancing digital trade, they are creating digital jobs, they are supporting Kenya with cybersecurity, research and innovation, data governance and regulatory reforms, and so on and so forth. So it's in my view, or in our view, speaking from an American chamber perspective, a very collaborative, a very deep and meaningful relationship, both commercial and in other areas, that Kenya has had with the US. And as you know, last year, we had our president being hosted by President Biden then for a state visit. And this is all just towards honoring this enduring relationship that Kenya has had with the US. So that's what I would say with respect to that. And if I bracket it in the tech space, I think that is something that we continue to see really deepening, and especially in this era where everything is tech, right? Every business is a technology business. And so the leadership that the US has when it comes to technology is really at full play in Kenya and in other parts of Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Max. And I think your point about every business becoming a tech business, even if we think about some of the most traditional industries and sectors in any economy, whether it's fishing or agriculture, I mean, technology is even permeating those and improving efficiency and productivity in those sectors. But Jane, let's dig in a little bit on the Silicon Savannah. So for those who don't know, Kenya has developed this reputation as the Silicon Savannah, and it's more than just a slogan. When we were there, we saw the reality of it in terms of the startups and the presence of not just American, but a lot of foreign technology companies. I mean, how did Kenya develop its reputation as a Silicon Savannah? What sort of drove that? Were there any enabling policies or homegrown successes?
First, before I go into your answer, also let me take the opportunity just to say thank you for having me, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. And it's a pleasure just to be here to discuss about Kenya's digital transformation. So to your question, what made Kenya to be known as the Silicon Savannah? I think first to say it's actually not really a branding name, but it also reflects a lot of years of government's, as you say, policy and also investments in infrastructure. To begin with, the early landing of undersea cables in Kenya around 2000 helped drive a lot of innovation in the tech startup scene in Kenya. We saw the growth of iHub, NILAB, Gearbox. Now they're even more decentralized. We have those in Lake Hub in the Kisumu area, Mombasa. We have Swahili Port. So all these centers have served as innovation hubs where young people meet and have formed an ecosystem of innovation. And then comes around also the issue of regulatory. So Kenya also has had a very strong government and policy leadership when it comes to technology and the value or the vision to have technology as a driver for socio-economic benefits. So Kenya's digital transformation has seen the development of the national ICT policy. We also saw the digital economy blueprint. And also we've seen a lot of liberalization of the telecommunications sector. And this happened actually earlier on because the liberalization of this sector also meant that a lot of telecommunications companies could also come into the scene. Now Kenya boasts of Safaricom, which has a very large footprint. There are others like Airtel, but Safaricom has had a very large footprint and has been able to provide services. Secondly, is also the innovations that have come about. Kenya was home to M-Pesa, and I just don't talk on M-Pesa because there are now so many others, but for a long time, we saw the digital footprint of mobile money beginning within Kenya and now has spread to the region. When you travel even globally, even when I'm in the US, I still am able to use that platform through different other platforms to move money around. And then lastly, we also have what you call a very strong mobile internet penetration. I mean, there's still challenges across the rural and urban, but for the most part, in anywhere part of Kenya, you're able to connect, and people are also very talented. We have a very young, talented workforce that is able to really utilize these services. So there's a complexity of issues, but at the end of the day, I think they've all worked for the best to ensure that Kenya has really driven its agenda. Even with the current presidency, they really have a strong digital agenda to ensure that it continues to drive Kenya's digital transformation. Thank you, Vivek.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. I mean, I think, there's sort of geographic reasons why Kenya has become really important and as a landing, its coastal position and sort of beachhead into East Africa and broader sub-Saharan Africa made it a very attractive landing spot for all these subsea cables. But, for people who aren't following this closely, subsea cables having a variety of connections just ensures a level of high speed, low latency, reliable connectivity, which if you're a foreign technology company and you want to expand your operations, if you want to, have reliable cloud services, this is essential. You can't have spotty internet access. And I think the connectivity piece that you mentioned, Jane, that Kenya has encouraged and facilitated through subsea cables, but also penetrating deeply into rural areas, has been really important for enabling this growth. And, if you're an American sitting in Washington, D.C., so a lot of people have never heard of M-Pesa, but if you're in East Africa, it's everywhere, right? This is ubiquitous, and I think it's an example of how Kenya in some ways has leapfrogged with technology, and in some ways has outpaced even what we're doing in the United States when it comes to mobile payments, I would argue. But Maureen, I would love to come to you, given your terrific experience in government, focusing on African issues and in some ways leading a lot of the partnership between our two countries. We've seen, in the last administration, high-level U.S. engagement with Kenya. During the Biden administration, when you served as Director for African Affairs at the NSC, President Ruto was the first African leader in 16 years to receive a state visit, which, it seems like an exceptionally long time to do that for any leader in such an important continent, but it is what it is. And Secretary Raimondo also made her first trip to Kenya when she was in the last administration. And I guess when you think about this surging interest from Washington and Kenya, you were there. What drove that interest? What opportunity did Washington see?
Well, thanks very much. And I echo the thanks to CNAS for convening this important discussion, and congratulations on the release of this really important report. The relationship with Kenya has always been strong since the independence 60 years ago, when we first recognized Kenya. And I think that it's always been a strategic partner economically, politically, for security reasons. But this momentum to elevate the Kenyan partnership has really been going on for quite some time. In the most recent history, in the first Trump administration, President Trump actually hosted former Kenyan President Kenyatta twice for meetings, which is unprecedented for African leaders to get 2 hits with the president in the Oval. And so that was really exciting for the Kenyan-U.S. bilateral relationship. And then that really continued to build in the Biden administration. So Kenya has always been a really strong and important CT partner, doing a lot of proactive work in Somalia in particular, on behalf of shared interests between the United States and Kenya. And in the last administration, Kenya really asserted itself into a global peacemaking role. So there has been an active effort that continues today with Kenya's leadership to build peace in the DRC. Former Kenyan President Kenyatta was also really involved in the Tigray peace deal, the cessation of hostilities agreement in 2022. Kenya also led pinnacle outreach to Eritrea, which is a country that a lot of partner nations in the United States certainly have not had great connectivity with. So there's been a lot of really important outreach that's been led from Nairobi. And then most significantly for direct U.S. interest was, of course, Kenya's leadership to step forward for the Haiti mission. So that really changed the scope of the conversation and put Kenya's thought leadership forward for global peacemaking. I think we also saw a really strong change and positive step forward in the relationship when the Kenyan Perm Rep to the United Nations, Martin Kimani, stepped forward with a really important speech in 2022 about the Russian aggression into Ukraine. And that speech was quite a signal to Washington, to national level leadership, about the strategic importance of Kenya's thought leadership on the continent. And then finally, just a bit of insider baseball, that former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had a really trusted and important partnership with Kenyan National Security Advisor Monica Juma. So with respect to regional affairs and other geostrategic issues, they used to call each other and strategize on different issues, which just led to a closeness of the discussion that allowed for an obvious decision when it came time for a state visit from the African continent for Kenya to be first in line.
Yeah, that's great, Maureen. And, I think I emphasized in my question the state visit, but that shouldn't obscure other important, just because something isn't a state visit, getting a visit to the White House with the president twice in the first Trump administration is a very important signal, and suggests there's sort of hopefully a bipartisan enduring interest in the U.S.-Kenya relationship. And I want to pick up on the point you made about, former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's connection with his counterpart in Kenya, just to emphasize the importance of people-to-people ties. And actually commercial diplomacy is something I wanted to focus on. When we were there, and when we've been in other emerging markets for this project, we're always struck by Chinese companies with support of the Chinese government's ability to offer integrated and comprehensive packaging, whether it's for telecommunications and cloud services and financing. And they have a different model than the United States, which is more private sector led. And we've actually seen efforts in this administration to embrace a more proactive commercial diplomacy approach. And I'm curious, like from your experience working on these issues, how do you think the United States could level up its commercial diplomacy in Kenya, and especially matching the sort of comprehensive packaging that Chinese companies have offered? And I'd also, you'd like to transition our broader discussion to digging in a little bit more into China's presence in the region and interest in the region.
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot over the course of the last several administrations about putting an economic foot forward, and that's something that President Obama tried to champion as well. It didn't necessarily reach fruition, and I think this administration, the second Trump administration, is actually putting action behind that. So we are seeing a fundamental change in the bilateral conversation, with the economic piece being first and foremost in the bilateral conversation across the continent, but certainly with Kenya as well. I think that it's tricky. One of the first things that I would have to recommend that the United States do to make itself more enticing partner for Kenya in this competition is certainly nominate an ambassador. Kenya, more often than not, has had a political ambassador, and that's a really strong show of the president's priority on Kenya to be able to put a trusted personal advisor there. So that would be the first thing, and then I would urge the Senate to swiftly confirm them. But I think also one of the things that we need to abandon is this idea of being the partner of choice. That's a nomenclature that was developed in previous administrations that we talked a lot about in terms of competing with China. I think that's an outdated model, and I think the Kenyans have been very clear that they're not interested in making a choice. President Kenyatta told President Trump that in the first Trump administration, and it's been a consistent point that Ruto has carried forward as well, which is that we have strategic partners around the world, including in the UAE, as well as in Asia, and we're going to continue to partner with whoever can address different parts of our requirements. And so I think that addressing the strengths of the U.S. private sector are where we want to try to find injects into the Kenyan economy. So as Max was saying, we have really strong U.S. companies that are based in Nairobi with regional reach, but also global dominance that we need to lean into. So being able to provide access for the U.S. private sector is something that this administration is changing the way that they're doing so. We've heard that ambassadors are being evaluated based on the access and the deals that they provide for U.S. private sector. That has not been, to my knowledge, part of the requirements for ambassadors in years past. So that changes the way that embassies are prioritizing their time and their human resources. And there's nothing that can replace a U.S. ambassador, particularly a political one who's close to the president, being able to provide a trusted introduction to a host nation official, to a U.S. CEO, in the way that former U.S. Ambassador Meg Whitman did repeatedly to folks in the tech sector in the United States.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. I mean, your reference to former Ambassador Meg Whitman, I mean, for those who don't know, she's also the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, an established tech leader. And I think one thing that was striking when we were in Kenya is how often her name came up, right? And she was no longer in the post when we were there last December. But I think it maybe it seems like an obvious point, but maybe one that we overlook sometimes in our commercial diplomacy. But having a strong, proactive ambassador with a direct line to the president, but also a direct line to and the senior administration officials. But if you're trying to compete on the technology domain, having somebody with that experience to connect to leaders in Silicon Valley. I mean, she helped facilitate, a reverse trade show that brought a lot of senior Kenyan officials to Silicon Valley and other tech hubs across the country. That seems like a small thing, but it does really matter in terms of facilitating relationships, exposing officials on both sides and leaders on both sides of the private and public sector in the two countries to opportunities and, enabling partnerships going forward. And we saw, for example, a major deal between Microsoft, G42, and to site a massive data center in Kenya shortly thereafter. So, but Jane, I wanted to come to you to dig into the Kenya side a bit more. Dig into the China side a bit more. How did China first establish its foothold in Kenya's tech ecosystem, and what advantages do you think that early entry conferred to its firms that persist today?
Okay, thanks for this question. And I have to say that we have to again look back to when Kenya was really beginning to digitize itself. And this was around 2000 with the landing of cables and the beginning of mobile telecommunications network. Because I think that's where the Chinese strategy came into full effect, because they looked at this at both the private sector and the government side. When we look at the investments that China came with, it was first partnering with Safaricom and being part of their partner that was able to roll out their national network. Again, Safaricom, for those who are not aware, is Kenya's national is Kenya's leading mobile network provider. So most of its network was partnered, and this was around the turn of the century, around 2004, around that time. Secondly, when you look at government policy documents, Vision 2030, the ICT policy, government has always taken a very proactive and lead role. The Kenya Digital Economic Blueprint, in one of its pillars, talks about digitizing digital government has been its key pillar. So I think that another strategy the Chinese has been able to do is study these documents and come very strongly as a partner, as a perceived partner to government to help them deliver on their agenda. And this has also been now laying out the vital national infrastructure that the government was looking for partners to be able to deliver on. This was the national optic fiber backbone infrastructure. This is extremely crucial because this was the connectivity that now laid connectivity across all government services across all 47 counties. So the entire infrastructure was done in phases, phase 1 and phase 2, that was funded not just by the Chinese company. So it came with the duality of the funding and the technology itself. And of course, there's always the issue of the geostrategic engagements. I think it's also important to note that the Chinese mode of doing business has also been very ingrained in rich networks across the country. So they are very present and they are very involved in most of it in the government policy making, because most of the policy making itself also has stakeholders who provide feedback into that. So that kind of gives them an edge. And also thirdly, there is also other initiatives done by government like connectivity and rural ICT access through USF funds. The Huawei again has been one of the strongest companies that has been able to partner with the Communications Authority in rolling that out. So looking at this kind of partnership or this strategic three-pronged approach, either government, private sector, not just through the national infrastructure, but also one thing that I didn't mention is also devices. When you look at the devices that most of Africans, especially young people in Kenya and in Africa, most of them are devices that are cheap, affordable, and are made in China. They meet the pocket because a lot of people, the economic needs are not as high power to buy an iPhone or a Samsung. So there's a lot of Chinese phones that are much cheaper that people are able to buy on. So this has been one of, I think I would say it's a very strategic placement of China. And this was also driven by the Chinese strategy itself. The Digital Silk Road, FOCAC, there's also been a lot of posturing by the government itself to bring not just its government policies, but also to bring the private sector. So I'm really glad to see that we're also discussing here about the private sector, because I think this is one strategy that the Chinese got very early, is that it's not just the government, the funding, but also the private sector. So when you bring the solution to the table, then it becomes very easy now then, as Maureen said, to sign the deals, because it's almost like a done deal. And also, as your report brought it out, there's also the way of how do you do government with some of our policymakers. You sit down and you agree on these things. So also having that face-to-face and do look at the African culture, unfortunately, although there's some positives and minuses there, I don't want to go into much details, but you can maybe bring them up later, has also enabled how the Chinese have really proliferated inside Kenya's tech ecosystem. Thanks.
Yeah, I would love to dig into that in a second, Jane, if you're game. But I think your point is well taken. That Chinese companies, I think sometimes people assume that it's all the Chinese government, and I think when it comes to tech in particular, they certainly work closely with the Chinese government and have a lot of support domestically and externally when they're working in key markets, whether it's project financing or other subsidies. But the companies themselves, and Huawei in particular, is extremely proactive at forging strategic partnerships with key entities like Safaricom or ICT ministries, and sort of shaping ecosystems through strategic partnerships like that. And I think just maybe an obvious point is that countries like Kenya still have basic sort of digital and physical infrastructure needs, and there aren't a lot of U.S. companies that are willing to deploy this stuff at scale at that level. With that said, now that a lot of these countries and markets have some of those needs met at a greater level, now you have sort of this next phase of economic ambition, which relates to cloud migration, AI services, improved connectivity. And that's where I think a lot of US and other firms have comparative advantages that can be brought to bear. They may not be digging fiber optic cables in markets like Kenya, but they might be building data centers for cloud and AI. And so I think this is the phase that we're entering now, I think, with markets like Kenya, that I think it actually makes it quite interesting and much more contested, I would argue. But Max, let me come to you for the next question, which is, when we think about the US technology offerings in Kenya, what do you see as their relative strengths and shortcomings? You work intimately with US businesses at the American Chamber of Commerce in Nairobi. How do you see the US comparative advantage when it comes to tech vis-a-vis China? And what do you think US firms could do? What do you advise them to do to be more effective?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And Jane and Maureen have covered quite a bit of ground. I'd just like to add one other thing on the China advantage, if you may, which is the speed to market, the speed to deploy. It's definitely an area where we're struggling a bit. I say we here, I mean the US private sector, in terms of just deploying solutions into the market. So key advantages or the strengths, if you may, from a US private sector perspective is, of course, the global leadership in terms of technology. If you're talking about AI, for example, the key or the big AI companies are all American. I mean, there's no doubt in that. So that's one. Then two, something that we don't talk much about, but we experience here, which is a very deliberate culture of localization and skills transfer. And so if you look at most of these companies that I talked about in our portfolio, and we currently have over 300 companies in our portfolio, a good mix of American and Kenyan affiliates, they are all practically led by locals. So locals, either Kenyans or of African descent. And so there's that sense of grounding that the American companies have, which is an edge, if you may, because they truly are able to integrate into how the way business is done here in Kenya. And then that strong reputation for governance and ethics is also an advantage and definitely a strength that American companies should be able to play. And then the ability to form partnerships and just work together and collaborate. So those strengths are fantastic. But on the other hand, like I mentioned, they do come with certain challenges, which, as I mentioned, the speed to market, a slower project rollout, and so on and so forth. So our recommendation to our companies, if you compare with what the Chinese are doing, is one, having a complete offer in terms of the solution itself, but you're also bringing the funding that can help get that across the line. So off-balance sheet funding is particularly great as an advantage, and it's something that we saw the Chinese utilize quite well here in Kenya. Then secondly, a domestication of solutions, such that the solutions is a very clear solution market fit. And it's not necessarily a copy and paste from the US. So, and you can only do that if you build the right partnerships, you build the right relationships, you're really grounded authentically in understanding what the market desires and how the market operates. And then you're able to deploy. So I would say those two. And then the third one is what Maureen had mentioned earlier around commercial diplomacy. So having the US government strongly support American private sector when it comes to engaging on deals and opportunities. It's something that has been lacking. We're seeing a significant shift now. That has changed quite a bit. But there are other countries that are way ahead of the US when it comes to supporting their own private sector to get deals across the line on opportunities that are available here. Back to you, Vivek.
Yeah, that's great, Max. I mean, I think on some level, because historically American firms have had such a strong advantage in terms of the quality of their offerings and the reputation, they could almost coast on a fairly limited engagement from the government, whereas but I think as that gap is narrowed, for example, with China offering, in some cases, not only cheaper, but like faster and as good or better offerings, whether it's in phones or 5G equipment, like the sort of natural advantages that U.S. firms once enjoyed or allied firms once enjoyed has eroded significantly. But the point that you mentioned about sort of financing is something I wanted to maybe pick up with Maureen, because one thing that policymakers in Washington, Democrat and Republican, have been thinking about is how do we bring more of our development financing and other tools to bear to help offset some of the advantages that China historically enjoys in some of these areas. So, the Trump administration, with a bipartisan support in Congress, created the International Development Finance Corporation in 2018. And there are other tools, whether it's EXIM or U.S. Trade and Development Authority. But Maureen, as someone who was thinking about how to integrate all these tools from the National Security Council, where do you see opportunities for the U.S. to be doing more to actually match some of the state financing and that China is offering, and others, not just China, but other governments are offering to help secure the edge that American companies once enjoyed?
Yeah, well, I have to say, I applaud the Trump administration in the first term for creating and re-empowering the DFC, sort of changing the model of what it was to become DFC. There's a lot of focus on DFC and EXIM and the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, USTDA, as sort of a trifecta to be able to work together in complementary spaces to advance U.S. private sector interests overseas. I think those are all really important, but frankly, I don't think they're going to get the job done. Our laws, our transparency requirements, which I believe are important for very good reason, make these processes a little bit slower than private sector needs. And so while I think it's really important, I'm thrilled to see that there's more money headed to DFC. I think that's fantastic. I think we have to be a little bit more creative. Ultimately, as Max said, the best offering has to be our foot forward. We have to be able to talk about why our product is superior from whatever U.S. origin it is, and to be able to demonstrate why that's a better overall value add. So obviously, U.S. foreign assistance models in this administration have been turned upside down. So I'm not going to recommend a bunch of U.S. aid programming. But frankly, the last several administrations have probably gotten it wrong in focusing on job training, for example, because there were no jobs for those Kenyan trainees to go into in the private sector. So it's more about what jobs can the U.S. corporations bring to the Kenyan market for higher level management positions and engineering jobs, as opposed to low-level menial labor, sort of like data farm analyst positions. That's not as interesting to people who have masters coming out of the Kenyan system in ICT fields. So I think it's about working with the U.S. private sector to think about how to create industry jobs in the offerings that they're making to the Kenyan public, and then working in complement with USTDA, EXIM, and DFC, who hopefully can figure out how to accelerate some of their processes and put a little bit more money behind it. But ultimately, I'm not going to point the finger unilaterally at DFC.
Yeah, I think that's a dose of reality. I think there's definitely opportunities for U.S. government development financing and other tools to make a marginal difference, and then sometimes those margins can be decisive. But I don't think we should be sober about how critical of a factor it is for some of these things. At the end of the day, like, the product has to be good, and people have to make the decisions on that basis. And I think Jane, I'd love to come to you. We talked a little bit earlier about strategic partnerships and the importance of or the success that Huawei and others have had with Safaricom and other, ministry level partnerships. But as someone who's closely studied Kenya's ICT policy and political system, and what factors do you think the Kenyan government accounts for when it's selecting among competing partnership offers for digital infrastructure projects? What is it prioritizing? And if you're advising, U.S. and allied firms to do a better job in this regard, what would you say?
Thank you, Vivek. Before I go into that question, I also want to weigh in on the last question, because I think, of course, double clicking on everything that both Maureen and Maxwell said, but I think there's one factor that was not touched on, and I think is very critical, is the movement of persons between Kenya or Africa and the US. I think especially when we are trying to promote business, we really also have to look at how do we enhance visas and logistical movement of goods and services. And that's its own policy issue that I really think that is a bedrock of how trade is able to flow. So now coming to your question about from my point, how do I believe the Kenyan government decisions are made when they're looking for partners? As you mentioned earlier, that first and foremost, Kenya has strategic partners. So it does try to cast a wide net on how it's choosing its partners. The first thing, of course, is looking at its policy. As I mentioned, Kenya is led by a very strong policy outlook and vision of how it wants to see the country through Vision 2030, and now we have the Digital Kenya Superhighway, the Digital Economic Blueprint, the ICT policy, that are all very critical documents. But what these policies also note is there's policy action to it, and policy action requires finances and it requires the technology. And when it comes to budgets and resources, the Kenyan government may not be able to meet this. So it has to look at its strategic partners who can support it. So it looks at those who have the technology and the financing. And I think this is also something, I believe it was Maxwell who talked about delivery and ability of scale. The ability to provide the financing and the ability to deliver on this. I think these are very important things. The financing itself, of course, is a key driver, because just the exchequer is not able to fund this. So there needs to be the funding behind it. I think the second thing that is there, of course, is the political and bureaucratic connections. How easily can we connect to the partner? How easily are we able to ensure that we can sign the deal and we can get this delivered? Governments work within political cycles. So every political leader wants to deliver within their scope. So ensuring that this is something that is done, they can say this is my legacy project. I think this is also something that we really have to note, that every president comes in understanding that they want to deliver legacy projects. So quick delivery and ability to scale that project becomes very, very important. And then, of course, it also sometimes it looks at the regional issues that are there. For now, the country has been also doing a lot of interconnections between the Sudan, Somalia, and so forth. So if there's already concessions or working with companies that are already funding that, then it becomes easier. For China, for example, they've had a lot of projects that are looking not just nationally, but regionally. So some of those regional projects or regional scoping make it easier for countries to go into their digital partnerships. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks, Jane. And one thing we've talked a lot about what U.S. firms or the U.S. government, whether it's through development financing or commercial diplomacy, should be doing to improve their odds and market share relatively in Kenya. But I'd like to take a moment to think about this question from the Kenyan government perspective, and maybe Max, I'll come to you. I mean, you work with U.S. companies that are trying to operate in Kenya, that are working with the Kenyan government. I mean, can you give us a sense of what hurdles they face in the Kenyan market? Mm-hmm. And also, if you were to advise the Kenyan government about what steps they could do to facilitate partnerships, not just from U.S. firms, but from foreign technology companies generally that want to help Kenya achieve its ambitions, like the Digital Superhighway Initiative or its 2024 Cloud Policy Act that essentially mandates migration across the public sector.
I think the big one here is policy certainty. And then, of course, the flip side of that is the problem, right? It's a hurdle. The policy and regulatory uncertainty that there is in Kenya is a bit of a challenge. And especially if you look at tax policy. Just last year, we had a significant economic presence tax introduced at 3%. It was actually meant to be higher. But as industry, we pushed back and managed to get that down to 3%. But that then replaced a 1.5% DST, digital services tax, that was there. I mean, some of these taxes are not necessarily a problem by themselves, but there's also the compliance costs that come with that. And because of the cyclical nature of some of these taxes coming in and some of these regulatory provisions that are being introduced, maybe sometimes even twice in a year, then it becomes very difficult to make any long-term, even medium to long-term planning from a strategic point of view. And that's a significant problem for companies here. So we are consistently advocating for a much more stable policy and regulatory environment. But I'm glad to say that Kenya has now enacted a national tax policy, which is in the process of being implemented, and hopefully that will be enduring for at least 3 or 5 years, and it should make it easier for companies to make strategic decisions when it comes to getting into the market and investing. So that's one. Then two is what I mentioned earlier around, the governance and ethics challenges that there are, including matters relating to corruption, especially if you are a company that is looking at public procurement. And yes, there is corruption even in the private sector, but I think that does lock out most American companies because of their high standard in matters relating to ethics. And so there's a bit of work that we need to do there as a country. We need to do there as a private sector as well, because the private sector is definitely a part of that problem. And so we need to get that right. I believe turning that around will also open a lot more opportunities and reduce the cost of doing business in Kenya. Then thirdly, and finally, one that I should mention is if you're a tech company, we see a lot of sensitivity around our intellectual property enforcement. Yeah, the laws are there; they're relatively okay, but it's the enforcement of IPR rights that is a problem. And so, if you're a brand owner, the counterfeiting that is there, the parallel imports, I mean, they do present significant brand risk, and that does put some of these companies, they're really not at ease, and they would rather shy away from bringing their innovations into the country if there's that risk happening. So those are some of the challenges that we see, and there could be others. But what are we doing about it? Two things. One is we do have a government that is very open to engaging with the private sector, and they are open to genuinely considering investment climate reforms or business environment reforms that would help advance the economy. There are challenges in that entire process. However, I think there is a really great opportunity, and that's what we hang on, which is engaging consistently with your technocrats, your policymakers, educating them on the impact of some of these policies and regulatory and legislative issues that there are, and then how we can reform so that we can meet the development and economic objectives that the country is looking for, which is a win-win for everybody, because its companies are part of the entire ecosystem. So bodies such as ours then have a significant role to play. And our advice to any company that is looking at Kenya is that whenever you have some of these challenges, do match up with us. We are more than happy to engage, surface those policy issues and help come up with practical recommendations while engaging with the policymakers for the benefit of all.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Max, for that really insightful answer. And, I know we're coming close on time. We have actually a bunch of audience questions. We're not going to be able to get through them all, but maybe we can get through a couple if everyone will maybe indulge me in providing a short answer, so we can take some of these. But I'll open this to anybody, but Maureen, I think maybe you're well positioned to answer this question. This is a question from Alish, who asks, how much has the stripping of U.S. aid to Africa hurt the U.S.-Kenya relationship?
Yeah, I have to say it has changed the relationship across the continent, and it has certainly changed the nature of the conversation with Kenyan civil society and the Kenyan populace. Insofar as the U.S. bilateral government-to-government relationship, perhaps not as much as we might think. So I think that and also I should say it has an effect on the Nairobi economy. I mean, my colleagues in Kenya could verify more aptly than me, but the disappearance of the aid community, as well as all the implementers and their regional offices that were all headquartered in Nairobi, has changed everything from like the real estate market to used car sales in Nairobi. But I think overall government to government, it doesn't necessarily have to change it. I think that the Kenyan government and partner governments across the continent have always said what they want more from the United States is more U.S. foreign direct investment and more private sector relationships. So that is really their top priority, and that's what the U.S. administration is currently saying that they're doing, and they're putting action behind that. So I don't think it necessarily has to change the government-to-government relationships, but I do think that it's changed how the citizenry might look at the United States going forward, particularly as Jane said about the visa issues and like the student travel visas and those kinds of things are fundamentally changing that conversation, less so the disappearance of certain U.S. aid interventions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Maureen. Maybe we'll do one more quick audience question, and then we'll let everyone go about their days. I know that Jane and Maxwell in particular are towards the end of their days in Kenya, and we want to respect their time. But one question maybe I'll direct to you, Jane, but Maxwell, feel free to jump in here as well. This is a question from Robin, and it's, what is the Kenyan outlook on the success or failure of Chinese-led smart city and ICT projects? Can you speak to the applicability of these projects to their original goals? Essentially, how effective have Chinese-enabled smart cities been within Kenya?
Thank you for that question. I'll take a jab at it. The key project here that we talk about in Kenya when it comes to smart city is Konza. Konza Technopolis is Kenya's smart city, and it has also investments by China, but not only limited to China. It also has investments by Japan. It has investments by Korea. They have KAIS. They also have investments by the U.S. So it's a broad-based smart city. So it is, of course, it's in the best interest for the Kenyan government to ensure that this smart city succeeds, because it's one of the Vision 2030. It's a keynote project of the country's development project. One of the key things that have been really slow is the funding of the projects like this and rolling it out. The Konza project itself has had a lot of delays. So at this point is not even just what has been invested in, but the delays of this project. China, Huawei built the Tier 3 data center. They are one of the most powerful data centers for government digital projects. And the government itself has started to move more and more of its services into that data center. So there has been a lot of positivity in the growth of the project, and not just within the Chinese investments there. But for me at this point, what I look at is the management and how quickly and in speed can we actualize the entire Konza project. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. And I think we'll have to stop there, even though we have a few more questions. And I apologize to those who submitted them. We're at time, and I've used my moderator prerogative and asked most of the questions. But I want to thank Maureen, Jane, and Max for making the time for this, I think, important, if frankly underappreciated conversation in Washington, D.C. I think if anyone who looks actually at what's happening on the ground in Kenya, there are enormous amount of changes at the policy level, at the investment level, and from the private sector, not only the United States, but within Kenya and from other foreign partners, including Chinese companies. And I think, the future of Kenya's digital trajectory seems bright, and there's an open question about which ecosystems and companies and governments are going to help Kenya enable its own technology potential, which is already manifested with the Silicon Savannah. And so stay tuned for more conversations like this. We're going to be holding a fourth series focused on Saudi Arabia in the coming weeks to mark the release of our fourth and final case study as part of this project. So please stay tuned, and thanks everybody for making the time to join us, and to all of our great speakers for their insights.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.